welcome to a brand new episode of It's Not That Simple. Decision Day is coming. That's right, the countdown to the all-important 2024 US presidential elections continues, and today we're delving deep into this topic with the objective of trying to explain why it's really not that simple at all. We're going to do it with the help of today's expert, Harry Enten, senior political data reporter at CNN, host of the Margins of Error podcast. Previously, Enten was at the renowned digital platform 538, where he became known for his data-driven, sharp political analysis. Harry, welcome to the show. I'm particularly interested in this conversation because this is the mother of all elections that's coming. We're not that far away from it at all. And let's start with the basics, because as opposed to most democracies, it's not one person, one vote across the United States. It's all down to the Electoral College. So let's start by explaining what it is.
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, thank you for the very kind introduction. My goodness gracious, I don't know if I can live up to it. Normally, I think in most countries, when you have a president, you think, okay, we're going to all vote nationally, and then we're going to tally up the votes, and whoever has the most votes wins the election. At least there's a runoff that's forced, and then you have if no one reaches 50%, and then you have a runoff between the top two vote getters, and then whoever gets the most votes in that election wins. That's not the way it is here in the United States. What we essentially have is 50 state elections plus the District of Columbia, who will all go to the polls on November 5th this year. They'll vote in 50 individual elections, and then the winner of each state will receive the electoral votes that are assigned to that given state. And what you're really doing is you're not voting directly for an individual. You're voting for a slate of electors, hence the Electoral College, right? These electors are appointed usually by the state parties, for example, or a state party convention. They're loyalists. Then whoever gets the most votes in the individual state, there are some slight differences across the states, Nebraska, Maine, perhaps we can get into it later. The electors for the side that gets the most electors will then be declared the winner. In December of that year, those electors will meet in the state capitol, and they will essentially have their votes tallied up. Let's say, you're in a state with just 3 electoral votes like Vermont, which is right near here in New York City. Those 3 electors will then have their votes sent to the Congress, and then the Congress will in fact count those votes come January, and then the Congress will count those 3 votes from Vermont along with the electoral votes from all the different states, and whoever, if anyone gets a majority of the electoral votes, that person will be declared the winner of the winner of the presidential election will be the next president of the United States.
We'll get into the fact that obviously we've had several presidents who lost the popular vote but still became president. We'll get into that in a moment. But I wanted also for you to explain how we got to the number of 538 electoral votes total. So how are those number of votes decided for each state?
It's decided in the Constitution. All of this comes from the U.S. Constitution, right? The idea that we're going to have electors instead of a popular vote. There are different reasons that we have an electoral college. For example, it gives smaller states some more power. It dates back to the 18th century when there was a lower voting population in the southern United States because of slavery, and they wanted their votes to be able to count for more. And what essentially it is the number of electors is determined by the number of members of the House of Representatives, that is the lower house in the Congress, plus the number of senators, which is 2 across every state. There is one exception to that rule. That's the District of Columbia, where, of course, our seat of government is, our federal seat of government. There was a constitutional amendment that essentially said that there would be 3 electors from the District of Columbia. But the 538 essentially comes from the idea that if you tally up the number of senators, which of course is 102 for each state, along with the number of members of the House of Representatives, which is 435, that gets you to 535, plus the 3 electors from the District of Columbia, gets you to exactly 538.
All right, so the magic number is 270, correct?
Correct, that's a majority.
Right. We'll we'll get more into detail on that too. But obviously here, it's all about maintaining the states for each party, maintaining the states that they're expected to win, and then going for the swing states. For all of us who are going to be following the U.S. elections and coverage in the days leading up to November 5th, can you explain what swing states are and how important they are as well for the respective parties?
Yeah, so look, when understanding the Electoral College, you have to understand that most states, again, the exceptions are Maine and Nebraska, have a winner-take-all. That is, let's just say you go to the state of Florida, for example, right? Even if the race is close, ergo, let's say Donald Trump wins there 50% to Kamala Harris's 49%. That's just an example. I think Trump's going to win Florida by more, but we'll just use that as an example. He would get all of the state's electoral votes. It's not proportional.
Correct.
Ergo, what that means is there are states that are deemed blue states, Democratic-leaning states like New York and California that have been fairly safely blue. Then there are red states, or the states that have been fairly safely Republican. A lot of those might be in the West, for example, states like Montana and North Dakota, South Dakota. There are bigger states as well, or more populated states like Tennessee. Ohio has become much more of a red state. And so you have these states that are pretty much safely into each side's column. At this particular point, it looks like there is north of 200 electoral votes that are safely Republican, north of 200 electoral votes that are safely Democratic. That means that the states that ultimately decide the election are these swing states, states that are not safely Democratic or safely Republican, states that either side could win. In this particular election, we're really just looking at 7 swing states, it seems like, 3 of which are in the northern battleground states around the Great Lakes. That's Pennsylvania, that's Michigan, that's Wisconsin. Those states have been swing states dating back all the way since 2000. And then you have these Sunbelt battleground states, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And those are the states that right now the polls show all of those states within 3 points. They've all been won by varying parties over the last, say, 8 years. In fact, the only state of the ones that I mentioned that has actually switched back, stayed the same since 2008 is actually Nevada, which has gone Democratic in each of the elections since 2008. And North Carolina is kind of not nearly the same as the other 5. It's only been carried once by a Democrat in the last, say, 44 years, and that was back in 2008 by Barack Obama.
Okay, so these are the states that we expect both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump to visit quite a lot, right? Because they're not going to go to the states they're expected to win, or they have a big majority already. They don't need to do that, but we're going to see a lot of speeches happening all over these swing states. Which are the top 2 or 3 swing states, and which are the tipping point states, so to speak, in your opinion?
Yeah, so first off, it's not just visits. It's also a lot of advertisements. You cannot turn on a TV in one of those 7 states I just mentioned without seeing a ton of advertisements from the different candidates.
Okay.
So that's one. The second thing is, look, since it's a race to 270 electoral votes, not all these states are even, right? Nevada only has 6 electoral votes. That means it's far less important than, say, Pennsylvania, which of the 7 states I mentioned has the highest number of electoral votes at 19. So when you're looking at the map, the Trump campaign, it's been argued, has sort of a 3-state strategy, which is win in Pennsylvania, win in North Carolina, which has 16 electoral votes, and win in Georgia, which has 16 electoral votes. Because if you win in those 3 states, which have 19, 16, and 16, Kamala Harris's path to victory is basically nil unless you win somewhere outside of these 7 battleground states. So if you're really talking about 2 or 3, it's those states. But at this particular point, if I was forced to choose one, I have always said it is the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Because if you look at it, that's really the state that more often than not is the tipping point state. And what do we mean when we say the tipping point state? What we essentially mean when we say the tipping point state is if you were to essentially model it out, what is the state that provides the electoral votes needed to get to 270 electoral votes. Which is the state that most often votes with the winner? Which is the state that puts that candidate over the top? It's most often Pennsylvania. It doesn't mean it's a guarantee, but at this particular point, given the high number of electoral votes that it has, given how close the polling is there, that's the state that's most likely going to help determine the winner. If you tell me who wins Pennsylvania, I can probably tell you who wins the election.
One more question about the electoral vote, then we'll move on. You explained that obviously it was created during the Constitution of the United States. We've had over 200 years since this document was created. My obvious question is, why hasn't it been updated? Why hasn't it been scrapped? I mean, so many things have changed in our society in the last 50 years, never mind the last 200. So why haven't there been movements, or have there been movements to go to a one-person, one-vote system and have just a popular vote for the presidency?
You know, what's so interesting is, you let me delve back into history. When we were first doing the Electoral College, there were a number of states that didn't actually even have a popular vote in the state. Some states did, but oftentimes, it was just the elites who were meeting in their state legislatures who were helping to, determine who would win the electoral votes in their individual states.
Okay.
As we flash forward, more states put in a popular vote. Now, obviously, all the states have a popular vote. But yet we have not moved to having a popular vote nationwide.
Right.
And why is that? Well, there are a few reasons why. One, the Republican Party at this point believes that they have an advantage through the Electoral College. So they have no reason to want to switch away from that, right? In both 2000 and 2016, Donald Trump got fewer votes. I'm sorry, in 2016, Donald Trump got fewer votes. In 2000, George W. Bush got fewer votes than Al Gore. But the Republican candidates got fewer votes than the Democratic candidates for president nationwide, but still were able to win. So Republicans are like, this system advantages us. Our base of support, our coalition is better fit for the Electoral College. So there's no real reason for Republicans in their minds to necessarily switch off. But there have been movements in the past. The closest such movement really was after the 1968 election. Why is that? Well, if you flip back to 1968, what are you really dealing with? Well, you're dealing with a Democratic candidate in Hubert Humphrey, a Republican candidate in Richard Nixon, and then you had an independent candidate or a third-party candidate in George Wallace. And George Wallace was a Southern governor, a segregationist, and he was able to win the electoral votes, win in a number of Southern states. And the rules, and this is so important to understand, is not who gets the highest number of electoral votes. It's who gets a majority of electoral votes. And so what nearly happened, and we can get into this a little bit more later, what nearly happened in that election was George Wallace nearly had enough support that kept both Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey from getting to 270 electoral votes. And so both at that point, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party felt like, hey, maybe we should go away from this system where a third-party candidate can have all this leverage over us. And so there was a real movement after the 68 election in order to get us to a popular vote system. It, in fact, got as far as the United States Senate, where it looked like it was going to pass and go to the state legislatures in order to amend the Constitution. But then it got held up there for any number of reasons. Yeah. So that was really the last time we really came close. There is still a movement now within the country in order to get a popular vote, but they've decided to go about it a different way. Instead of amending the United States Constitution, what's so important to note, as I hinted out earlier on, is there's actually nothing within the Constitution which says how states must assign their electoral votes, right? It could be done by the state legislatures. It could be done through a popular vote in the state where the side gets the most number of votes in the states and therefore the electors all go to them. Or what's going on right now is there's something called the Popular Vote Compact, in which a number of states, in fact, a lot of Democratic states, I believe at this point, totaling well north of 100, if not north of 200, I think it's north of 100 though, who essentially say, once we get 200 states totaling 270 electoral votes to sign on, we will say that we will give the electoral votes in our state, regardless of who our state votes for, to the person who wins the most number of votes nationwide. No Republican state has signed on to this, but a lot of Democratic states have signed on to it. It'll be interesting to see if that movement ever gets beyond just the Democratic states, or Democrats are able to control enough state legislators in order to pass a law. But there's still movements about, but at this particular point, they're not all that close.
Okay. It all sounds quite complex.
Yes,
and it also sounds like it's not going to go anywhere because it hasn't gone anywhere.
No.
Right, it hasn't gone anywhere in so long. But let's move on from that. I wanted to talk to you about polling, because every time I followed the U.S. elections, elections in general, but U.S. elections in particular, I did used to pay a lot of attention to polls. Who's ahead in the polls? And then 2016 happened, and Hillary Clinton was the favorite according to the polls, and Donald Trump ended up winning. So what do the polls tell us right now, Harry, and how much can we trust them leading up to November 5th?
So I think there are a few things there. Number one, Hillary Clinton did get more votes than Donald Trump, but she didn't win the election.
Good point.
But look, if you look at the polling right now, it just describes the closest race that I've seen in my lifetime. In fact, I think it's the closest race that most of your audience will say that they've seen in their lifetime. Basically, if you look, for example, at the national polls, which I think just distills it to a single number, neither Trump nor Kamala Harris has ever led by at least 5 points in the national polls. That hasn't happened pretty much in the last 60 years. There's at least some stretch of the campaign where one candidate leads by at least 5 points. That is, for 1 second, you think that one of the candidates is going to stretch it out and maybe win the election rather easily. When you go down to the important swing states that we mentioned, they're all within 3 points. They're all within 3 points in the average.
That's insane, no?
It's the closest election I have ever seen. People ask me, who do you think's going to win? I can honestly say, I don't know who's going to win. I don't know who's going to win. So the polls point to a very close race. The question, though, is whether you can trust the polls that say that they point to a very close race. I think the thing that is so important to keep in mind about polling is it's a tool. It's not Nostradamus. It's not going to go out there and say, by gosh darn it, this candidate is going to win X percentage and this other candidate's going to win Y percentage, and I can guarantee it. That's not the purpose of polling. The purpose of polling is to tell you whether or not the race is close. Right. And the poll in 2016, for example, did suggest that it was a fairly close race. I used to work at 538, for example, as you mentioned in your kind intro. And we actually said that Donald Trump had about a 30% chance of winning. 30% chances of things happen all the time. If you take a coin, for example, and you flip it in the air, the chance that it lands on the same side twice in a row, let's say heads, is 25%. So we were basically within that realm. And what has happened over the last few cycles is that the elections have become increasingly close and close and close and close and close. In fact, at least according to the U.S. popular vote, we have had every election since 1988 be determined by single digits. That's the longest such streak in American democracy. So I think part of the reason you think the polling is bad is because it's not necessarily picking the winners as frequently, but part of the reason for that is because the elections have become so close that a 5-point error when one candidate's favored to win by 30 points doesn't mean very much, but a 5-point error when a candidate's favored to win by 3 points can mean all the difference in the world.
Gotcha. All right, so talking about the issues that are going to decide this, is it the issues really, like traditionally it's been about guns, about abortion, about the economy, just to pick three of, I guess, the top ones, or is it going to be just down to rhetoric, and is it going to be down to likability / popularity on that particular day?
So, look, in our national elections at this point, 40% are Democrats, 40% are Republicans, maybe 20% are in the middle, and in reality, we're talking about probably more like 5 to 10% that are in the middle. And the question is, how are those 5 to 10% of voters really going to determine their vote? Well, I think, when it comes to issues, the fact that the economy, if you look across different metrics, has kind of been middling, is part of the reason why, the election is so close, right? So the economy is a big issue. And if you look at the polling, people say that the economy is the biggest issue. It's roughly, depending on what poll you're looking at, it's about 25 to 30% of voters who say the economy is the most important issue. And if you focus in on the undecided voters, they say, again, the economy is the top issue.
Okay.
The second most important issue is actually no issue at all. Ergo, it could be about personality. It could be about the rhetoric from the different campaigns. And what you're essentially looking at right now is this, I think at this point, it's really about averaging about 4 to 5% of undecided voters. What they're saying is that we don't necessarily like Kamala Harris. We don't necessarily like Donald Trump. And we're going to kind of go into the voting booth, hold our nose, and we're going to kind of flip it. These are people who don't pay a lot of attention to politics, who could be swayed by a last-second ad, could be swayed by rhetoric, but could also be swayed by, maybe the price of their groceries on that particular day, for whatever reason, was $1 higher or $1 lower. So there's a lot going on there. These people really are not totally focused in on this election yet. But at the end of the day, you're really dealing with both Harris and Trump sort of having their issue bases. Trump, the economy and immigration. Harris has abortion very much on her side. But because voters are so split on those issues and the economy is kind of middling, it sort of lends itself to the close election which we currently have.
I've been surprised at how little foreign policy has been mentioned, and I say this mostly because we have two raging wars going on at the moment. One, Russia-Ukraine, the other, Israel-Middle East, whether that's Gaza-Palestine now with Hezbollah in Lebanon. How different could foreign policy be with Harris or with Trump, and how much are people really concerned about that, especially if you talk foreign policy, you bring in China, which is such a big player in this kind of geopolitical dynamic?
Well, I think, one of the interesting things is how little foreign policy matters, right?
Okay.
If you look at the polling when Russia invaded the Ukraine, in fact, foreign policy in that particular war was actually amongst the most important issues, but it's kind of fallen back. Part of the reason it's fallen back is I just think that most Americans don't feel the effects of those wars within their own families, right? It's
Correct.
not something that they necessarily feel. Normally, when foreign policy plays a big role, it's like the Iraq War, right? That
Or
was
Afghanistan.
Or Afghanistan,
Yeah.
when we're sending soldiers overseas. That's just not the case in this particular instance. So I think that's part of the reason that people just don't care nearly as much about it. That's not to say there aren't voters who do care, but that the vast majority of Americans, it's really just not in their list of most important issues. The foreign policies between these two folks are very, very different, right?
Yeah.
You could talk about what's going on in the Middle East right now, and despite the fact that there are a lot of those on the left who are not necessarily pleased with how the Biden administration has handled the situation in Israel, believing that the Biden administration is too friendly to Israel and not necessarily sympathetic enough with the Palestinian people, those in Gaza. The fact is that Donald Trump was the one who moved put the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem after many American presidents didn't do so. He's somebody who's probably going to be even more so on the side of Israel. You go to Russia and Ukraine, and what do you see there? Well, we know that Trump has said any number of times on the campaign trail, I got to get these guys in a room. I got to get Zelensky and I got to get Putin in a room and I got to make a deal. I would expect that administration would be far less supportive of Zelensky in Ukraine than the current administration would. But, there's another thing. You mentioned China, right? And this kind of topped in with the economy. Donald Trump wants to put on tariffs. That's an economic issue, but it's also a foreign policy issue, and how countries react to the tariffs that the Trump administration might be able to put in. So, look, the bottom line is that the Trump administration is a much more populist administration, a much more protective administration than the more free trade administration that a Harris, presidency would probably bring.
We're getting here to the latter end of our conversation. Before I hit you with some quick fire questions to kind of close it out, you said this is the closest election you can certainly remember. Is it the most polarized election you can remember as well? And with the impact and influence of social media and the various tactics from a paid media perspective that both sides use. I mean, is this just going to get more and more kind of distanced away from any middle ground with these two parties?
Well, polarization is certainly at a near all-time high in the United States. I think you probably have to really go back to the 1880s to find anything close to it. So, yeah, I mean, the parties are further apart. No one seems to want to apologize. The rhetoric is as harsh as it's ever been. Some folks would argue that's because, the Republican Party is more harsh than the Democratic Party, but there are some folks who would argue the exact opposite. And so the distance between the two parties really has never been greater. That being said, there's actually been some depolarization on a number of interesting metrics. For example, if you look at the polling, what you do see is that it does seem like Donald Trump, although perhaps not as much as in the beginning of the year, seems like he is going to pick up a larger share of the black vote than he did 4 years ago and certainly 8 years ago, likely to pick up a larger share of the Hispanic vote than he did 4 years ago and certainly 8 years ago. If you look at age, you see that Trump it seems to be doing better among voters under the age of 30. While the flip side of that is Harris seems to be holding her own, if not doing slightly better than Biden did among white voters, and holding her own, if not doing slightly better than Biden did among voters who are 65 and over. And so we do see some depolarization, at least among some demographic lines, even if we're seeing increasing polarization among political party lines.
I'm not going to ask you who you think is going to win, because you already told me it's pretty much 50-50 and it's the closest ever. But how many electoral votes do you think will differ the two candidates in the final result, in the final numbers? How close really is it going to be when it comes down to it?
I mean, you can easily draw out a map in which Kamala Harris wins the election with exactly 270 electoral votes. All it takes is for her to win all of the states that Joe Biden did last time around, minus any of those 7 swing states, and then add in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, while losing in those Sunbelt battlegrounds, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. If she does that, she gets to exactly 270 electoral votes. I'm not going to say that's going to happen, but what I am saying is that's really how close this election could be. Now, it could turn into a situation like we've had both in 2016 and 2020, where the election in a number of states was decided by about a point or less, but one candidate was basically able to win across all of those states that were won by a point or less. So you could end up with one candidate getting in the high 280s, 290s, even into the 300s. But that's not a guarantee. This election is likely to be very, very close, at least at this point. Of course, given the news cycles and given how many crazy things have already happened, I never would have thought, as I sit here with you, that Kamala Harris would have been the Democratic nominee at the beginning of the year, at least when Joe Biden was winning all those primaries. With still much time to go, who knows what might actually happen down the road.
Okay, so I've got a quartet of quick-fire questions for you.
Come on, bring it on.
They're more philosophical. I know you're a data guy, but these are more philosophical questions. So first off, and obviously this is all drawing upon your experience and expertise, what's one quality that a good leader could benefit from having?
Humility.
Humility,
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go.
Humility. I think the ability to recognize that you're not always right and that you're able to take into account other folks' opinions and to be able to switch course when new information is presented to you. It's something, I'm not saying I'm a leader in any stretch, but it's certainly something that I take into account in my everyday job. And I think is part of the reason why you have me on this show and part of the reason why I've been able to do what I've been able to do in my professional career is because as new information is presented, I'm willing to adjust my opinion on a particular topic.
Okay, the biggest challenge the world faces today.
What is the biggest challenge the world faces today? I would say that it is either an ability to adjust in a world in which we do not get our information from consistent sources, that is through social media, in which folks are not necessarily hearing the truth and can listen to and it might be saying something that's completely foreign from the truth, and making sure that the truth seeps into all corners of the internet, I think is very important going forward. And then obviously, look, I think the biggest challenges the world faces today are the two wars that could reshape Europe, and obviously peace in the Middle East, although peace in the Middle East has been as long as I've been alive, has been something that a lot of people have tried to achieve, and they haven't been able to do so quite yet.
Okay, I've been lenient on the first two. The last two, I want one word or one sentence. So, the third question is, if you could change one thing in the world by magic right now, what would that be?
World hunger.
Okay, that is, you could think it's a throwaway answer, but it's definitely an important one, taking into account the issues there are with overpopulation as well in certain segments of the planet. Finally, what's the most important learning of your life and or career?
Donald Trump winning the Republican nomination in 2016 taught me that things that we didn't think were possible were in fact quite possible, and history isn't always prologue, especially when you have a small sample size.
Harry, it's been fascinating to talk to you about this D-Day that's coming. It's gonna get here faster than we can imagine. So keep up the good work, keep up informing people, keep up making sure that the truth gets into those different corners of the internet and beyond.
I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to let the curtains close on another episode of It's Not That Simple. Definitely such a riveting topic, and we all want to know what happens on November 5th. Maybe we won't know on November 5th. Maybe it'll be only on November 6th or 7th or later, depending on how close it gets. But we're all counting down the days and hours until this heavyweight match between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris happens in November. That'll do it from us on this occasion. See you soon.